Somebody help my son. The scream ripped through the grand ballroom of the Whitmore Foundation gala like shattered glass across marble. Conversations died mid-sentence. Crystal forks froze inches above $5,000 plates. A violinist near the stage missed a note so sharply that several guests turned before they even understood what had happened. Then came the sound nobody in the room would ever forget. The splash. Small. Violent. Final. 8-year-old Lucas Whitmore had vanished beneath the surface of the glass infinity pool that stretched along the edge of the rooftop ballroom overlooking downtown Chicago. For half a second, nobody moved. Not the hedge fund managers. Not the politicians. Not the security team standing 20 feet away in tailored black suits with earpieces blinking blue. Hundreds of eyes watched the water ripple under the golden lights while the richest people in the city stood frozen behind champagne glasses and designer smiles. Ethan Whitmore, billionaire founder of Whitmore Dynamics, dropped to his knees near the edge of the pool, his face drained of color. "Lucas," he shouted again, his voice cracking in a way nobody there had ever heard before. Ethan Whitmore did not lose control. Not in boardrooms. Not in public. Not even when markets crashed. Forbes once called him the coldest mind in American tech. But at that moment, he looked less like a billionaire and more like a terrified father watching the only thing left in his world disappear underwater. And still, nobody jumped in. Some guests whispered for security. Others backed away from the pool, careful not to ruin $600 shoes on the wet marble floor. One woman covered her mouth and muttered, "Oh my God." Another quietly pulled out her phone. Because people always record tragedy faster than they stop it. Then suddenly, a chair scraped hard against the floor. Naomi Carter moved before her mind could catch up to her body. 1 second she was carrying a silver tray filled with untouched champagne flutes near the service entrance. The next, she was sprinting across the ballroom in black non-slip shoes and a pressed hotel uniform with her name tag slightly crooked from a 12-hour shift. "Ma'am, stop," someone shouted behind her. A manager reached toward her arm, but Naomi pulled free without even looking back. The cold night air hit her face as she reached the pool edge. Through the water, she could barely see the small outline of Lucas sinking beneath the reflections of chandelier lights trembling across the surface like broken stars. Ethan stared helplessly into the water, panic locking his body in place. And Naomi saw something in his eyes she recognized immediately. Fear. Real fear. The kind that strips power away from people and leaves only the human being underneath. Without hesitation, Naomi kicked off her shoes and dove. Gasps exploded across the ballroom. The water swallowed her instantly, silk-black fabric twisting around her arms as she reached through the icy darkness toward the little boy drifting beneath the surface. Somewhere above her, people were shouting. Someone yelled for paramedics. Someone else screamed Lucas's name. But underwater, there was only silence. Naomi's fingers finally caught the sleeve of the boy's tiny navy blazer. She pulled him close, wrapped one arm around his chest, and kicked toward the surface with everything she had left inside her. The second they broke through the water, the entire ballroom seemed to inhale at once. Naomi dragged Lucas onto the wet marble beside the pool as water streamed from her uniform and gathered beneath her knees in shimmering puddles under the ballroom lights. The boy was pale. Too pale. His small body lay frighteningly still against the cold stone while the skyline of Chicago glowed behind them through walls of glass and steel. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across Lake Michigan, low and heavy, like the city itself was holding its breath. "Lucas," Ethan whispered as he stumbled forward, his expensive shoes splashing through pool water without a second thought. His hands trembled violently. Not the controlled tremor of anger people feared in boardrooms. This was different. This was terror stripped bare. Naomi immediately tilted Lucas gently onto his back and checked his breathing. Nothing. Around them, the ballroom had transformed into chaos. Wrapped in luxury. Diamond necklaces flashed beneath chandelier light while frightened whispers bounced between marble columns and towering floral arrangements worth more than some people's rent. Guests who had spent the evening discussing mergers and stock valuations now stood frozen around a drowning child, uncertain what to do with real human fear. "Where are the paramedics?" someone shouted. "Move back," another voice yelled. But nobody really moved. Nobody except Naomi. Her soaked curls clung to her forehead as she leaned down and pressed 2 fingers carefully against Lucas's neck. Still nothing. And suddenly she was not standing inside a billionaire gala anymore. She was 17 years old again in a crowded emergency room on the south side, watching doctors rush past her little brother while her mother cried into folded hospital paperwork they could not afford. She still remembered the sound of those machines. The smell of antiseptic. The helplessness. The silence after. That was the night Naomi learned how quickly life could disappear while people waited for someone else to step in. "Come on, baby," she whispered softly as she positioned her hands and began chest compressions exactly the way she had practiced years ago in nursing classes she never got to finish. 1, 2, 3. The ballroom fell silent except for the sound of her counting and the distant hum of helicopter blades somewhere above the city. Ethan dropped beside his son, his face pale beneath the gold ballroom lights. "Please," he said quietly, almost like he was speaking to God instead of a waitress. "Please save him." Naomi did not answer. She kept counting. Calm. Focused. Steady. Because panic never saved anyone. Across the room, several guests had started crying quietly. A woman clutched her husband's arm. One of the servers covered her mouth with shaking fingers. Even the musicians near the stage sat frozen beside abandoned violins and champagne towers. Then suddenly Lucas coughed. Water spilled from his mouth onto the marble floor. A sharp gasp tore through the crowd. Naomi quickly turned him gently onto his side as his small body jerked and struggled for air. The sound that followed was messy and uneven and beautiful. Breathing. Ethan's eyes widened in disbelief. For one long second, the billionaire who controlled billion-dollar acquisitions and commanded entire industries simply stared at Naomi like he could not understand what he was seeing. Lucas opened his eyes weakly, confused and trembling. "Dad," he whispered. Ethan pulled his son into his arms so fast it looked almost painful, emotion crashing through him without warning. The room erupted at once. Applause. Crying. Voices overlapping. Relief flooding the ballroom like a tidal wave. But Naomi barely noticed. She sat back quietly on the soaked marble floor, breathing hard, her hands shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. Her uniform clung heavily to her skin, her name tag half hanging loose. And still, even after saving the most important person in Ethan Whitmore's world, some people in that ballroom continued looking at her the same way they had all night. Like she was just staff. The paramedics arrived 4 minutes later, but by then the hardest part was already over. Red and blue emergency lights flashed silently across the ballroom windows, washing the skyline in pulses of color while guests stepped aside in designer gowns and tuxedos to clear a path through the crowd. Lucas clung weakly to his father's shoulder as a medic wrapped a warm blanket around him and checked his breathing again. "He is stable," one of them said carefully. "You are lucky someone acted fast." Lucky. The word hung strangely in the air. Ethan Whitmore looked across the ballroom toward Naomi as though he had just noticed her for the very first time. She stood near the edge of the room now, dripping water onto polished marble while another waitress handed her a towel with trembling hands. Her makeup had washed away. Her uniform was soaked through. And yet somehow, she carried herself with more composure than anyone else in the building. Around her, the gala slowly tried to restart itself. That was what wealthy people did best. Recover appearances. Servers quietly replaced overturned glasses. Event staff wiped water from the floor. A jazz pianist near the stage awkwardly touched the keys again, soft notes. floating into the tension like nothing life-changing had just happened 10 feet away. But nobody was really listening anymore. Because every eye in that ballroom kept drifting back toward the black waitress who had jumped when nobody else did. Naomi lowered her gaze as whispers traveled through the room like smoke. "Did you see her dive? She saved his life. I heard she works double shifts here. Wait, she actually knew CPR." Some voices sounded impressed. Others sounded surprised in a way that felt uglier. As if competence looked different than they expected. Naomi knew those looks well. She had seen them her whole life. The kind that quietly asked how someone like her learned something valuable. A hotel manager named Richard stepped quickly toward her with forced concern painted across his face. "Naomi," he said under his breath, smiling tightly while cameras from local media crews continued snapping photos nearby. "Go get cleaned up before you draw more attention." Draw more attention. Naomi almost laughed at the irony. 2 hours earlier, she had been invisible carrying trays between tables while guests snapped fingers for refills without ever reading her name tag. Now suddenly everyone in Chicago seemed to know her face. "I am fine," she answered softly. Richard's jaw tightened. "This is still a private event. Please let the professionals handle things from here." Naomi nodded once because she understood exactly what he meant. Men like Richard preferred gratitude quiet and out of frame. Heroism was acceptable as long as it returned quickly to the kitchen entrance afterward. Before she could answer, a small voice interrupted them both. "Miss Naomi." The ballroom went still again. Lucas stood wrapped in a gray emergency blanket beside his father, his damp hair curling against his forehead. He looked exhausted, pale, fragile. But alive. Ethan remained close behind him with one protective hand resting lightly against the boy's shoulder like he was afraid Lucas might disappear again if he let go. The child looked directly at Naomi. "You saved me," he whispered. Naomi's expression softened instantly. "You are very brave," she said gently. Lucas shook his head. "No. You were." Ethan's eyes lowered for a moment as if the words hit somewhere deeper than he expected. This was a man accustomed to controlling rooms with a single sentence, yet now he stood silent while his 8-year-old son said the one thing nobody else wealthy enough in that ballroom had managed to say all night. "Thank you." And somewhere behind the chandeliers and skyline views and million-dollar conversations, something invisible inside Ethan Whitmore began to crack. The gala should have ended right there. Any normal event would have. But billionaires do not cancel evenings because of fear. They bury it beneath polished speeches, expensive whiskey, and carefully rehearsed smiles. Less than 30 minutes later, servers were once again moving through the ballroom carrying silver trays under soft gold lighting while Chicago's elite pretended their world had not almost cracked open beside an infinity pool. Yet something had changed. The air itself felt different now. Heavier. More honest. Naomi sat quietly alone inside a small employee break room near the service elevators on the 42nd floor, wrapped in an oversized hotel sweatshirt someone had handed her after she changed out of her soaked uniform. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead while an old vending machine hummed against the far wall. It smelled like burnt coffee and industrial detergent, the hidden side of luxury nobody downstairs ever saw. Her hands still trembled slightly from adrenaline. Not because she regretted what she did. Because now that everything was quiet again, exhaustion had finally caught up with her. Naomi leaned back against the metal locker behind her and closed her eyes for a second. Her body ached. Her sneakers were still damp. She had another shift tomorrow morning starting at 7. Life did not pause because somebody rich noticed you for 5 minutes. Across the city, rent was still due. Hospital bills still waited on her kitchen counter. And her mother still needed medication insurance refused to fully cover. That was the thing about people like Naomi Carter. The world called them heroes for one night and invisible again the next morning. A soft knock interrupted the silence. Naomi opened her eyes slowly, expecting another manager asking her to stay out of sight. Instead, the door opened to reveal Ethan Whitmore standing there alone. No security team. No cameras. No assistants whispering into Bluetooth headsets. Just the billionaire himself wearing a dark wool coat over a wrinkled dress shirt that still carried faint traces of pool water near the sleeves. For a moment neither of them spoke. The contrast felt almost unreal. One of the wealthiest men in America standing inside a cramped employee break room with flickering fluorescent lights and dented lockers. Ethan looked around quietly, taking in the tiny room where staff ate microwave dinners while guests upstairs ordered $30 desserts without checking prices. "This is where they put you after saving my son?" he asked finally, his voice low. Naomi gave a small tired shrug. "It is where employees take breaks." The word employees landed harder than she intended. Ethan noticed. Of course he did. Men like him were trained to detect tension hidden inside conversations worth billions. But tonight, for the first time in years, Ethan Whitmore was standing inside a problem money could not instantly solve. "Lucas asked for you," he said carefully. Naomi looked up. "Is he okay?" Ethan nodded slowly. "He keeps asking if the woman who saved him made it home safe." Something softened in Naomi's face then. Small. Human. Real. Ethan saw it immediately. The strange thing was, he had spent years building technology designed to predict human behavior through algorithms and data patterns, yet this woman sitting in front of him felt impossible to calculate. She had jumped into freezing water without hesitation while a ballroom full of powerful people stood still protecting jewelry and reputations. Ethan loosened his tie slightly, almost uncomfortable in his own skin. "Why did you do it?" he asked. Naomi frowned faintly. "Because he needed help." Most people froze. Most people were afraid. Ethan looked down at the floor for a long moment. Somewhere downstairs, applause suddenly echoed through the ballroom as another wealthy donor gave another polished speech about leadership and courage. The sound almost felt cruel now. Ethan let out a quiet breath. "You know," he said slowly, "people spend their whole lives trying to impress me." His eyes lifted toward hers. "Tonight you were the only person in that building who did not care who I was." Naomi studied him for a second before answering softly. "No, Mr. Whitmore. Tonight I cared that you were a father." For a few seconds, Ethan Whitmore forgot how to answer. The fluorescent lights hummed softly above them while Naomi's words settled into the room with the quiet weight of truth. Not investor truth. Not media truth. Real truth. The kind people spend their entire lives avoiding because it forces them to see themselves clearly. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly and loosened his posture in a way that almost looked unfamiliar on him. Men like Ethan built empires by never appearing shaken. Yet tonight, the walls around him had cracks wide enough for humanity to slip through. Before he could speak again, his phone vibrated sharply inside his coat pocket. The screen lit up with a flood of notifications. Messages from board members. News outlets. Social media alerts exploding faster than his public relations team could contain them. Someone had uploaded a video. Of course they had. Ethan glanced down at the screen for half a second before locking it again. He already knew what the internet was seeing tonight. A billionaire frozen beside a pool while a black waitress saved his son in front of Chicago's elite. The headlines practically wrote themselves. Naomi noticed the expression cross his face. "Bad news?" she asked quietly. Ethan let out a dry breath somewhere between a laugh and exhaustion. "Depends who you ask." Downstairs, the gala had shifted into something stranger now. No longer a celebration. More like a room full of powerful people trying to figure out how quickly morality changes when cameras are involved. Guests who ignored Naomi earlier were suddenly speaking her name with admiration polished carefully into their voices. Some called her brave. Others inspirational. But Naomi understood something painful about praise. It often arrived only after survival. Ethan studied her for another moment before speaking carefully. You said you studied nursing. Naomi nodded slightly. 2 years. What happened? A pause. Tiny. Heavy. Naomi looked toward the buzzing vending machine against the wall instead of his face. Life happened. Ethan stayed quiet. She appreciated that more than fake sympathy. My younger brother got sick when I was 19, she continued softly. My mother was working 2 jobs already. We fell behind on bills. I left school to help. Ethan's expression shifted slightly. And your brother? Naomi swallowed once before answering. He passed away waiting for treatment we could not afford. Silence filled the break room again, but this silence felt different than the ballroom upstairs. Not awkward. Honest. Ethan looked away toward the lockers, jaw tightening almost invisibly. In the world he came from, people solved problems by writing checks large enough to make pain disappear quietly. But there are some truths money cannot survive hearing. Naomi noticed the guilt moving behind his eyes. She had seen it before in wealthy customers whenever conversations drifted too close to reality. It was a long time ago, she said gently. No, Ethan answered quietly. It was a long time ago for everyone except the people who lived through it. Naomi looked at him then. Really looked at him. For the first time all night, Ethan Whitmore did not resemble the man magazines called ruthless or untouchable. He looked tired. Not physically. Spiritually. Like someone who had spent years running from grief so fast that success became the only language left in his life. Another knock interrupted them. This time the door opened immediately before either could respond. Richard, the hotel manager, stepped inside with visible tension stretched across his face. Mr. Whitmore, he said quickly, almost breathless. The press is asking if you would like to make a statement before the gala closes. Ethan did not answer immediately. Richard's eyes shifted briefly toward Naomi, and for a split second, annoyance flickered across his expression before professionalism covered it again. Ethan noticed. Actually, Ethan said slowly while standing to his full height, I think there is someone else they should hear from first. Richard blinked. Sir. Ethan turned toward Naomi with a calm expression that made the entire room suddenly feel smaller. Come upstairs with me. Naomi frowned slightly. Mr. Whitmore, I am still on shift. Ethan's voice remained quiet. But something inside it had changed. No, he said. Tonight, you are not just staff. The ballroom quieted the moment Ethan Whitmore stepped back inside. Conversations faded one table at a time until even the soft jazz near the stage seemed unsure whether to continue. Hundreds of eyes followed him across the marble floor beneath chandeliers dripping with gold light like frozen waterfalls. But tonight, for the first time in years, Ethan was not the most important person in the room. Naomi walked a few steps behind him wearing the oversized gray hotel sweatshirt over plain black slacks, her damp curls tied loosely back now, her name tag removed somewhere during the chaos. She looked uncomfortable under the attention. Not weak. Just unaccustomed to being seen by people who usually looked through her. The moment guests recognized her, whispers spread instantly again. Phones rose into the air. A local news anchor near the front lifted an earpiece and began speaking urgently to her cameraman. Somewhere near the back, someone started clapping softly. Then another person joined. Then another. Within seconds, applause rolled across the ballroom in waves. Naomi stopped walking immediately, startled by the sound. Ethan glanced sideways toward her and noticed something surprising. She was not smiling. Most people dreamed their entire lives about finally being acknowledged by powerful rooms like this. But Naomi Carter understood something dangerous about applause. Sometimes the same people clapping for you today were the ones who ignored your humanity yesterday. Ethan stepped slowly onto the stage overlooking the Chicago skyline while Lucas sat wrapped in a blanket near the front beside paramedics who continued monitoring him carefully. The boy's eyes never left Naomi for even a second. Ethan approached the microphone. The room fell completely silent. He stood there for a long moment, looking out across investors, executives, politicians, celebrity donors, and reporters. People who had spent years hanging on his every word. Yet tonight, Ethan Whitmore looked strangely unsure where to begin. "I was supposed to give a speech tonight about innovation," he said finally, his voice low and steady through the speakers. "About leadership. About changing the future." A faint uncomfortable laugh moved through the crowd. Ethan did not smile. "But about an hour ago, my son almost died 10 feet away from this stage." Silence again. Heavy. Honest. Ethan looked toward Naomi standing near the edge of the ballroom as cameras focused tightly on her face. And while a room full of powerful people froze, he continued carefully, one woman moved. Nobody shifted. Nobody checked phones now. Even the waitstaff stood still beside untouched trays. Ethan's voice lowered slightly. "I built my entire career believing control was strength. That power meant always having answers." His eyes drifted toward Lucas. "Tonight I learned something different." Naomi lowered her gaze slightly as the ballroom listened without breathing. Ethan stepped away from the podium unexpectedly and walked directly toward her through the crowd. Reporters moved instantly to follow. Camera flashes exploded across the room like lightning. Richard, the hotel manager, looked completely panicked now, tugging nervously at his tie as Ethan stopped directly in front of Naomi. Then the unthinkable happened. Ethan Whitmore, billionaire founder of one of the most powerful tech companies in America, extended both hands toward a black waitress standing in borrowed clothes beside a ballroom full of wealthy strangers. "Naomi Carter," he said clearly enough for every person in the room to hear, "you saved my son when nobody else did." His voice cracked slightly on the final word. Real emotion. Unfiltered. Human. Ethan swallowed hard before continuing. "And I am ashamed it took a tragedy for this room to finally see your worth." The silence afterward felt enormous. Somewhere near the stage, a woman quietly began crying. Lucas smiled weakly beneath his blanket. And for the first time all night, Naomi Carter looked completely speechless. Naomi could feel every camera in the ballroom pointed at her now. The lights felt hotter. The room smaller. Somewhere beyond the towering windows, downtown Chicago shimmered beneath the midnight sky, but inside the ballroom, nobody seemed interested in the skyline anymore. They were watching a billionaire publicly unravel in front of a waitress he would never have noticed 12 hours earlier. Ethan still stood directly in front of her, hands open, eyes heavy with something far rarer than gratitude. Humility. Naomi swallowed softly, uncomfortable beneath the attention gathering around her like floodlights. "Mr. Whitmore," she said carefully, almost quietly enough to disappear beneath the silence, "you do not owe me anything." A murmur moved through the crowd immediately. Some people nodded politely as if her humility made the moment more inspiring. Others looked confused, because wealthy rooms understand transactions better than kindness. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. "That is where you are wrong," he answered. "I owe you everything." The words landed hard. Honest. Unrehearsed. Near the back of the ballroom, reporters exchanged glances while fingers flew across phone screens. Headlines were already spreading through social media faster than champagne ever flowed at these events. Billionaire CEO breaks down after waitress saves son. Hero server praised at Chicago gala. The woman nobody saw. But Ethan Whitmore no longer seemed concerned about headlines. For years, he had mastered the art of controlling narratives. Tonight he was simply telling the truth. Ethan slowly removed the watch from his wrist. Several guests gasped quietly the second they recognized it. Platinum. Custom Swiss made. Estimated value nearly $600,000 according to one whispered voice near the stage. Ethan held it toward Naomi. "Please take this." Naomi immediately shook her head. "No," the answer came so fast it startled him. "It is not payment," Ethan said carefully. "I know," Naomi replied softly. "That is why I cannot accept it." Another silence swept across the ballroom. But this one felt different. Heavier somehow. Because people were no longer watching wealth save someone. They were watching dignity refuse to be bought. Ethan looked at her for a long moment, and for the first time in years, he seemed completely unsure how to proceed. Most people around him spent entire careers trying to get closer to his money, his influence, his approval. Naomi Carter was standing in front of all of Chicago's elite, rejecting all three without anger or performance. She simply knew her value before he acknowledged it. Lucas suddenly tugged gently on his father's sleeve from nearby. Ethan glanced down. "Dad," the boy whispered softly, "she saved me because she is good. Not because she wanted something." Ethan stared at his son for a second as those words settled somewhere deep inside him. Children often expose truths adults spend fortunes hiding from themselves. Slowly, Ethan lowered the watch back into his hand. Then he turned toward the stage again, expression sharpening with sudden clarity. "Richard." The hotel manager nearly jumped hearing his name called through the microphone speakers. He forced a nervous smile and stepped forward through the crowd. "Yes, sir." Ethan's voice remained calm. Too calm. "How much does this hotel pay Naomi Carter per hour?" Richard blinked rapidly. "Sir, I do not think this is the appropriate time to discuss staff compensation." Ethan did not look away from him. "How much?" Richard cleared his throat uncomfortably. $17.50 an hour. The ballroom went dead silent. Some guests visibly shifted in embarrassment. $17.50. That was what the woman who saved a child's life earned serving drinks to people discussing billion-dollar acquisitions over imported steak and wine. Ethan nodded slowly once, almost to himself. Then he looked back toward the crowd filling the ballroom. "Interesting," he said quietly. "Because tonight, the least valuable person in this room turned out to be the most important one here." The silence after Ethan's words felt almost physical, like pressure building beneath the ballroom lights. Nobody laughed. Nobody checked their phones now. Even the servers stood frozen beside silver trays as the truth settled across the room, one uncomfortable heartbeat at a time. $17.50 an hour. That was what Naomi Carter earned carrying drinks through rooms full of people who spent more on wine than she made in a month. Richard forced a weak smile that looked ready to collapse at any second. "Mr. Whitmore," he began carefully, "Naomi is a valued employee and—" "Stop." Ethan's voice was calm, but it cut through the ballroom sharper than shouting ever could. Richard immediately fell silent. Ethan stepped slowly back toward the stage while cameras followed his every movement. "Tonight," he said into the microphone, "a woman this city trained itself not to notice saved the most important person in my life." He paused, eyes sweeping across the crowd. "And some of you are still more uncomfortable with her salary being mentioned than with the fact that none of us moved fast enough to help my son." Several guests lowered their eyes immediately. Others stared ahead stiffly, caught between guilt and pride. Because wealthy rooms are built on an unspoken agreement. Never expose the machinery underneath the elegance. Never remind people who cleans the glasses, folds the linens, carries the plates, or gets ignored long enough to become invisible. But tonight, invisibility had shattered in front of live cameras. Near the back of the ballroom, one of the younger servers quietly wiped tears from her face. Another staff member looked at Naomi with something close to awe. They all understood what this moment meant. Not because a billionaire was speaking kindly to a waitress. Because for the first time, someone powerful was admitting the room itself had failed her long before it applauded her. Ethan turned toward Richard again. Effective immediately, he said, Whitmore Dynamics is ending its sponsorship contract with this hotel. Audible gasps spread instantly through the ballroom. Richard's face went pale. Sir, please, there is no need to make emotional decisions. No, Ethan interrupted quietly. There is every reason. The ballroom cameras flashed non-stop now, turning the room into bursts of white light and frozen expressions. Ethan continued speaking. With the same cold precision that once made him feared in boardrooms across the country. Any institution comfortable benefiting from people while refusing to truly value them does not deserve my company's support. Somewhere near the front row, applause suddenly broke out. Small at first. Then stronger. Then louder. Within seconds, the ballroom erupted again, but this applause sounded different than before. Less polished. More emotional. Naomi stood motionless through all of it, overwhelmed by the noise crashing around her. She never wanted attention. She never planned to become the center of a room like this. She simply saw a child in danger and moved. Yet somehow, that simple act had forced an entire ballroom to confront itself. Lucas suddenly slipped away from the paramedics and walked slowly toward Naomi, still wrapped in his oversized blanket. The crowd softened instantly watching him stop beside her. Miss Naomi, he asked quietly. She knelt slightly so they were eye level. Yeah. Lucas looked down shyly before pulling something from his pocket. A small silver compass attached to a worn leather string. My mom gave this to me before she died, he whispered. Ethan looked visibly startled hearing that. Lucas held the compass toward Naomi carefully. She said good people help you find your way when you are scared. Naomi's expression broke for the first time all night. Not dramatically. Just enough for emotion to reach her eyes. Lucas, Ethan said softly, you do not have to give that away. But the boy shook his head. I want her to have it. The ballroom stood completely silent again watching the child place the tiny compass into Naomi's trembling hand. And somewhere deep inside Ethan Whitmore, the last wall around his heart finally gave way. By the time the gala finally ended, Chicago was nearly asleep beneath the rain-streaked glow of midnight traffic. Black SUVs lined the curb outside the hotel while reporters remained crowded behind velvet barriers hoping for one last statement from Ethan Whitmore. But inside the ballroom, the energy had changed completely. The speeches no longer mattered. The investors no longer mattered. Even the towering ice sculptures melting slowly beneath chandelier light seemed strangely unimportant now. Because the story people would remember from that night was not about money. It was about the moment humanity walked into a room dressed like a waitress and forced power to look itself in the mirror. Naomi stood quietly near the service hallway holding the small silver compass Lucas had given her. Her fingers traced the worn edges carefully while the sounds of cleanup echoed through the ballroom around her. Stacked dishes. Rolling carts. Tired footsteps. The hidden soundtrack of workers restoring luxury after rich people went home. She had changed back into her black uniform again because that was what life demanded. Hero or not, her shift still had to be closed properly. Across the room, Ethan finished speaking with paramedics before Lucas suddenly broke free and ran toward Naomi one more time. Wait, he called. Naomi turned just in time to kneel as the little boy wrapped his arms tightly around her neck. For a second, the entire ballroom seemed to soften around them. Ethan watched silently from a few feet away, hands in his coat pockets, eyes carrying the kind of emotion no public relations team could choreograph. Thank you for not leaving me, Lucas whispered. Naomi smiled gently, brushing damp hair back from his forehead. You do not ever have to thank someone for helping you breathe. Ethan looked down briefly after hearing that. Maybe because he understood the sentence was no longer just about his son. Slowly, he walked toward them. The powerful businessman who once controlled rooms through intimidation now looked like a man learning humility one painful truth at a time. Naomi, he said quietly, Whitmore Dynamics funds a medical scholarship program every year. Naomi listened carefully but said nothing. It was named after Lucas's mother, Ethan continued. Tonight, I want to expand it. He paused. In your brother's name. Naomi's breath caught slightly. Real grief never disappears. It simply learns how to sit quietly inside people until someone unexpectedly says the name attached to it. Ethan reached into his coat pocket and handed her a folded card. Full tuition. He said softly. Any nursing school in the country. Paid in full. If that is still something you want. Naomi stared at the card in silence while emotion flickered carefully across her face. Not shock. Not greed. Something deeper. The fragile feeling of being seen by the world after years of surviving inside its blind spots. Mr. Whitmore, she began quietly. Ethan shook his head once. This is not charity. His eyes drifted briefly toward Lucas. This is me finally understanding the difference between success and worth. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Outside the windows, rain slid slowly down the glass while city lights blurred gold against the dark Chicago skyline. Somewhere in the distance, a siren echoed softly through the night. Naomi looked down at the compass in her hand again before finally slipping it carefully into her pocket beside the scholarship card. Then she smiled. Small. Honest. Tired. My brother always wanted me to finish, she whispered. Ethan nodded gently. Then maybe tonight he helped save my son too. The ballroom lights dimmed one row at a time as staff began shutting the event down around them. Rich guests disappeared into elevators and black cars. Cameras packed away. Music stopped. But something invisible lingered in that room long after midnight. Because power had filled the ballroom that night. Yet the strongest person there turned out to be the woman everybody almost overlooked.